Thank you very much, Father. As always, a very enlightening, very sincere, very profound presentation. We have at least 15-20 minutes for questions, so if you could just speak up. You don't have to identify yourself, but I know there are questions out there. You don't pose any, I will. You don't want me start talking again. Somebody is pointing to the person in front of them. Oh, that's right. Do you know that you're being volunteered to pose a question? Who? There's someone in the front row that wants to pose a question? Yes, please.
Well, I will pose a question. I will be the first.
Please do.
Well, I'm intrigued about the title of your book. Why jousting? The connotations of medieval tournament, knight errants, lances. Why jousting?
Well, isn't that kind of another word for battling, jousting with someone else? Well, it's an image of his battling with Satan. Like, that's what the title means to me. Jousting, another word for fighting with somebody.
But he's wondering whether the medieval, the tournament dimension, because jousting, as the gentleman mentioned, is
Chesterton was very, very much medieval minded, and it's an image. Like it comes from the prayer card at his funeral that I quoted too. They use that word, so I think that's where I basically got the idea from. His funeral card and Delamar's poem, Jousting.
Thank you.
When did he live and when did he die?
He was born in...
Oh, do you want to stand at the mic?
Sure.
Or unless you want to sit down.
No, that's okay. No. He was born in 1876. He died in 1936. He joined the church in 32. He would have joined earlier, but his wife, Frances, was not ready. But she joined 4 years later. But he was already a Catholic when he wrote Orthodoxy in 1910 or so. Probably overworked himself, like he didn't take care of himself. Like some of the arguments against his canonization, he loved cigars and eating, and he didn't take care of himself, But, so I call him a different kind of saint. The essence of sanctity is love, and he loved greatly. I think he was a very loving man. And one of his virtues was keeping friendship with people he violently disagreed with, like with Wells and Shaw. They probably didn't agree about anything, but they were friends. And Wells said once, he was asked, when you die, what are you going to say to God? He said, well, I'll say I'm a friend of Chesterton. He thought that was good. That's quite a compliment, really. But they say Chesterton didn't have any enemies because he respected the person. And he could argue with you all day and then go out and have a beer with you. And he said everything is wrong with Bernard Shaw except himself. Now that's very profound. That is, he respected him as a person, but he disagreed with everything he thought, Everything is wrong with Shaw except himself. But that was that's a great gift of charity to be able to do that, not to take things personally. Chesterton had that gift. He could really disagree with you and still love you. He said, Jesus said we should love our friends and we should love our enemies and love one another. He said often they're the same person. No, you want to get that right. Love your enemies and love your friends because often they're the same person. Yes.
Neighbor, isn't it?
Pardon?
Love our neighbor.
Yes, okay, love your neighbor because often and your enemies because often you're the same person. Thank you. So I think he was he was very charitable, and I think that's what the church looks for, basically. Not so much your asceticism. I think he will be. Yes,
I have a comment. I wish Chesterton were alive today with all the militant atheism, Dawkins and Hitchens, God is not great and the God delusion. Is there any, I wish you were alive today.
Well, that's why,
Like with all this militant atheism,
That's
Dawkins,
why
Hitchens, Dennett, yeah.
that's why the Chesterton
Santa
Society in America is trying to keep alive his writings, and he foresaw all these things that are happening. Like I said at the beginning of my talk, he foresaw almost everything that's going on today. That he saw the seeds were already in the early part of the 20th century. So very, very prophetic in that sense. So that's why, if he was alive, we can keep his writings alive, and that's what we're trying to do, is keep his writings alive. So I hope you become more interested in reading him, and it's very powerful. Yes,
For him personally, were there things that were very important to him for equipping himself?
I don't think I can hear you. My hearing's a little bad.
Okay, for him personally, is there anything he would say that was very important for him for equipping himself for jousting against the devil, like in his daily life?
Well, I think as I said at the beginning, he saw it mostly as guarding your mind, of this technique that the desert mothers and fathers had. So he would say, I think, really pay special attention to your thoughts, because bad thoughts lead to bad actions. So I think for him that was the great protection, I think. He certainly didn't do much fasting.
Oh, yeah.
But he would say, guard your mind. Watch what you think. And today, with all the inundation of words and that, there's a lot of information, but there's very little wisdom. So we have a lot of stuff going through our minds, but not much wisdom there. So he would say, guard your mind, basically. Yes?
Can you tell us about the G.K. Chesterton Society? Like, you're saying keep
I,
it alive?
in the States, there's a G.K. Chesterton Society that I belong to. Did you ever watch EWTN? Dale Elquist,
No, I
he has
haven't, sorry.
he has a weekly program on Chesterton. Anybody seen that program? EWTN? Yeah, so it's worth watching. So it's growing. It's a growing society, and John Gay mentioned that you need to start some Chesterton societies. We had one in Ottawa, huh, John,
Ronald,
years ago.
what's his name, Ronald?
Well, John said there's one in Toronto, but it's not very active.
Ian Boyd was a great writer.
Oh yes, well, he's the editor of the Chesterton Review.
Yeah.
So he's a great Canadian Chestertonian, probably one of the greatest.
He's my cousin.
Pardon?
He's my first cousin.
Oh, bravo.
Okay. So he's one of the great Chestertonians of the world, Ian Boyd. But unfortunately, Canada doesn't have a great interest in Chesterton. I don't know why. Yes, Bob?
C.S. Lewis went around the RAF before World War II and during the Battle of Britain. Is there anything comparable with G.K. Chesterton, World War I, working in the strengthening of morale and that sort of thing?
I'm not exactly sure what to say. He foresaw the Second World War years before anybody else about Hitler, and came out very strongly. And he was very, very much protective of the Jewish people too. So they see him as one of their heroes as well. But he foresaw Hitler years before the war started. And he called the First World War at the end armistice. That it couldn't last the way it was. It wasn't a peace. And there's a collection of writings called The End of the Armistice, which is the Second World War. that it was, you know, the Versailles Treaty, etc., was no solution to what was going on. And one of his geniuses is that he loved to be a journalist, not to write a Summa Theologica that would last forever, but he wanted to be involved in daily events. And because he was so insightful, these became immortal works, I mean, in my opinion, you know. Like his books, like someone asked him, what's your best book? He said, I don't have any best books. He was just right involved in the events of the day, but with a great faith vision. So his works are still worth reading. You have to, change some of the details, but the vision that he had of faith in society I think is unparalleled. He's really great man of great faith. So I hope you can become more interested in his writings. People ask me, well, what should I read? Well, it depends. Do you like poetry? Do you like Lives of the Saints? Do you like theology? It depends what you like. If you like Lives of the Saints, read St. Francis of Assisi. If you're into the intellectual world, read his book on Thomas Aquinas, which scholars say is one of the best books ever written on Thomas Aquinas. They called it the Dumb Ox. He has that wonderful scene that Thomas is at a main table with the king or somebody, and all of a sudden he bangs his fist on the table, and the king says, and Aquinas says, and that will take care of the Manichaeans. And the king says, get him a scribe. He was always thinking about something. Take care of the Manichaeans.
Father, what is your favorite book that Chesterton?
I think St. Francis of Assisi. It was the first book after he became a Catholic, and he poured out his Catholic faith in that book. And that's where I get the title of my book on his mysticism, The Tumbler of God. He said St. Francis went through kind of a spiritual somersault, and when he landed on his feet, he saw the whole world differently. And I have a section on some other so-called mystics that they made the same somersault, but they landed on their heads, like Tolstoy and other people. But the Tumbler, St. Francis of Assisi is a marvelous, marvelous book. He recommends in that book sometimes to stand on your head and see the world differently. And you'll see everything kind of hanging from the sky, that everything depends on God. Yes.
Father Bob, one of the things, I think what you're pointing to is something that's so evident throughout the world, that there's this, and I was shocked to hear what you said about the Anglican rite removing the renunciation of Satan in their baptismal rite. Why do you think it is that there's such a resistance or fear, like there might be an acknowledgement of generic evil, but the personification of the devil? What's behind?
Well, it's a very difficult truth. Very simply, to believe that there's evil spirits at work in the world. It's something very difficult to swallow. But often there are things that are so enormous. Like I remember reading an editorial by the New York Times about the Holocaust, and one of the closing comments was that there are some things so enormous that there must be some other cause to evil in the world besides human beings. So I think just basically it's a hard truth, and it's better to just wish them away. So yes.
What was the reason behind Chesterton's conversion, and what was he before he was Catholic?
What was your second part of the question?
Was he an atheist?
Yeah, no, he was. I think his family were Unitarian, something very vague. They hardly went to church. But then, because of his wife, who was a very strong Anglican, he became Anglican. But the cause of his conversion was simply his intellectual journey. He has a book called The Catholic Church and Conversion. And if you ever want a really good book of the intellectual journey of someone coming to Catholicism, I would recommend that book. So I think that book would answer your question. He worked through, you know, the bad popes and the Crusades and all the rest of it, and he finally discovered that Catholicism was the true church. And when he became a Catholic, somebody asked him, "Why did you join that thing?" And he said, "I will write a book about the thing." And that's his book about the Catholic Church. It's called The Thing. And again, it's a wonderful book about the truth of Catholicism. You just see, like Cardinal Newman, they just came to discover that the truths that the Catholic Church teaches today were present 2nd century and 3rd century and 4th century. Scott Hahn is like that too. They went to the fathers of the church, and it's all there. I asked a friend of mine once why she became a Catholic. She was, I forget, the Mormon or something. She said, "I asked the question, what happened before 1500? So I think it was his own intellectual journey. He just convinced himself that Catholicism was the true faith, philosophically, theologically, historically. He had a great devotion to Our Lady. And so I think he'll be canonized someday. He was called the defender of the faith, I think, of Pius the 11th or somebody. Yes, Father? Huh?
Yeah, some of his writings, he writes about Jews and Judaism.
I can't hear you. I can't hear you.
In some of his writings, he writes about Jews and Judaism, and even he kind of compares Hitlerism to Judaism. He says that Hitlerism is a form of Judaism. You know, there's some things that he wrote kind of in the 30s that raise questions. You know,
Yeah.
Obviously in retrospect with what happened in the Second World War, there are some writings that some things that seem to be problematic.
Yeah, that's certainly true. At a conference, a rabbi gave a talk on that question, and he concluded that Chesterton wasn't anti-Semitic, but there are things. Basically, Chesterton believed in a homeland for the Jews, and sometimes that was taken as, we don't want them in our country, but he was what we call a Zionist very early. And so, but there are problematic things, I agree, in his writing. But this rabbi was convinced that, and Chesterton had personal Jewish friends, which is, a good sign as well. And he wrote so much that, anybody who wants to have a case for or against almost anything in his life, you could find it. Because they still haven't collected all his writings. They're still discovering things that they've never seen before. And he's one of my mentors, and I hope it becomes more part of your own Catholic journey.
We'll take two last questions, then you and I think.
Okay.
One was just a comment. I'm interested in Chesterton, but I haven't read a lot of his. I bought Orthodoxy some years ago. It didn't click initially for me, but you mentioned Dale Ahlquist, who's done a lot of promoting Chesterton. I think he's written 3 books on Chesterton. The first was G.K. Chesterton, Apostle of Common Sense. He's got 1 chapter on each of his major books, and lots of great quotes. So I just thought that's a very good introduction to him.
Yeah, he's a good friend of mine too.
Can I just add to that, for those of you who, for whatever reason, don't have much of an opportunity to read, at St. Pat's Basilica, in their wonderful bookstore downstairs, you can get a superb DVD that, I think it's a 2 or 3 hour DVD, which is hosted by Dale Ahlquist, where I think it's even entitled G.K. Chesterton, Apostle of Common Sense, and this DVD gives you a kind of summary of all the important insights that G.K. Chesterton, had developed throughout his lifetime. So that's, for those of you who are interested in a kind of basic introduction, that's a wonderful tool also. And
I would just like to echo Father Wilde's suggestion that we consider reviving the Ottawa Chesterton Society, which, as he mentioned, flourished in the 1990s until it perished of its own Chestertonian excesses.
Are you smoking too much or what?
Chastened and enlightened by the experience of the past, we might, if there are sufficient interested parties, revive it. And the first instrument for doing so would be to leave your name and contact information in a book which you will find on the book table, surrounded by marvelous works of literature, including 2 by Father Wilde, both of which are Chestertonian. One, the one he mentioned, The Tumbler of God, but the other one, Catherine's Friends, relates the influence of 6 famous people on Catherine Doherty's life and her influence on them, and one of these 6 is Chesterton. So I would also propose that you give consideration to that book as well.
And may I suggest that everyone give consideration to buying as many books as possible from Justin Press.
Yeah.
Dr. Gay is the publisher of Justin Press, which is the publisher of Father Bob Wilde's books, at least some of them. And you have a chance on your way out to purchase the book. Or did you bring any other books, Dr.
Yes.
Gay? Okay, so please do that. And on your way out, you got in without making any kind of donation. I just wondered, because I had trouble finding the donation box. But on your way out, you'll see there's a flyer announcing this event. There's a $20 bill taped into the bottom of this clear box, to give you a hint. And I just want you to know that anything that is collected on our way out will be given exclusively to Father Bob Wilde. People who take the vow of poverty usually need some money. So, you can't travel down from Cumbermere on a sleigh, and even if you could, actually you probably can now, but you'd still have to buy and feed the dogs. So please, whatever the Lord places in your heart, say that there is the clear box on the outside, because I literally found it a couple of minutes before the event, which is why I was so late in running in. But we're going to thank Father Bob if there are no other questions. The last thing I want to do, just 2 short announcements. One relates to certainly the most important activities of the Sheptytsky Institute during Lent, which is our liturgical services. If you're ever in the area, please drop by the Sheptytsky Institute chapel for our liturgical services. We have them throughout the academic year. I've got a schedule here if you're interested in picking one up. The other thing is, speaking of the Chestertonians and other people who really use their brains and not just their emotions, this Friday evening, none other than the great Rusty Reno, R.R. Reno, will be exactly at this spot here, delivering a lecture that is the Weston Lecture. It's sponsored by Augustine College. It's an annual event. How many of you have never heard of Rusty Reno? All right. Okay, well, that's okay. I'm ego te absolvo. Rusty Reno is the editor of First Things. You've all heard of First Things, right? Okay. So he's a brilliant theologian. I know. You just the name didn't. You all thought the name is Reno, right? I know that. So anyway, he's presenting a really important lecture. It's entitled. It's got the phrase "critical thinking." I think it's against critical thinking. This is brilliant. Every third grader now is a master of critical thinking. So they're constantly rejecting everything that you tell them. We now have 2 generations of people whose fundamental approach to epistemology is oppositional defiance disorder. And so no matter what you present them from the perspective of faith, they're using their quote unquote critical thinking in order to engage you, but they actually don't engage you at all. They really don't think per se, they just reject. Sorry, I'm a little polemic here. He will be presenting what I've said to you just now on a much, much higher level. So I really encourage you, and if you have teenagers, university friends that are constantly arguing with you about abortion, same-sex marriage, you name it, bring them on, bring them here. It'll be a very, very enlightening evening. Absolutely, as always, a marvelous job. Father, God bless you. Thank you so much.
Father mentioned that Catherine met Shaptipsky. She was in Europe interviewing people for magazines, and she worked for a lecture bureau. So she met Chesterton in London, and he said, "Come, I'll take you out for some good ale." And she said, "I don't like ale." And he said, "You will like this." So they went out to a pub and had a really good meal and cheese and English, sausage, and she really enjoyed it. But he wasn't able to come to the States at that time. But she liked him very much, and I'm sure she read all his Father Brown stories. And anyways, she met the great man.
Great. And we like you very much, Father. Thank you.